Kabini Komara, former Prime Minister of the Republic of Guinea, and Jean-Hervé Jezekel, Project Director at the International Crisis Group. Before giving the floor to the chair for this session, we will view a short introductory video for the panel.
This panel will explore innovative strategies and specific mediation mechanisms for internal conflicts in Africa, seeking to understand and resolve complex challenges. Emphasis will be placed on solutions tailored to the African context and on promoting sustainable peace, drawing on the achievements and limitations of institutional mechanisms and ongoing or completed mediation processes. What are the institutional and political challenges confronting mediation in Africa? How can the effectiveness of African actors in mediation be improved? What are some new African mediation practices?
Mohamed Lulishki, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I do have the distinct privilege to moderate this first session, for which we will listen to two eminent prime ministers that have experienced how to mediate and how to stabilize their respective countries. The Prime Minister of Guinea and the former Prime Minister of Guinea and former Prime Minister of Burkina Faso. At the same time, I think that you and I will enjoy listening to two eminent experts. One is coming from France. He is a member of the International Crisis Group in charge of the project for the Sahel region. And our colleague, Mr. Sajai, who is the member of the United Nations Mediations Unit. The central topic of this session is about mediation. Mediation is a variation of negotiation which involves a third party. But we are not talking about any conflict in any part of the world. We are talking about internal conflicts which have international ramifications and international impact. And we are talking about internal conflicts within our continent, Africa, that unfortunately continue to distinguish itself with half of the peacekeeping operations of the United Nations that are still going on in Africa. Mediation is a very complex process. It requires financial and human means. It requires the selection of the best profile of a mediator that could be acceptable to the parties, whether sovereign states or non-state actors. It involves a lot of diplomacy in order to find compromises between the parties. There is a tendency to confuse facilitation and mediations. I think that most of the parties in a given conflict want to label the mediators as only facilitators, which the purpose of this distinction is to limit as far as possible the powers of the mediators. The mediators go beyond facilitating the contact, beyond trying to go between the parties, but he or she has the possibility to put forward some element of compromise without any intention to impose them on the parties. Because one of the main features of mediation is about its voluntary aspect, is the fact that it is not imposed to the parties, but it is solicited by the parties. With these few words, I would like to turn first to the former Prime Minister of Guinea, Mr. Kabini Komara, who will share with us his insights, his experience in dealing with mediations in our common continent. You have the floor, sir.
Interpreters cannot hear the speech of Mr. Kabini Komara. Can someone please fix the problem? Can someone fix the problem? Interpreters cannot hear the speaker. We're sorry. Can someone from the control room please solve the problem of sound? Interpreters cannot hear Mr. Kabini Komara's talk. Sorry. Interpreters are ready to translate, but unfortunately no sound is reaching us. I think you are legitimately required to wave to someone to say, or even to the speaker, to tell them that we cannot hear them. We're sorry, we're willing to translate, but we cannot hear. Bear with the technicians and the interpreters, please. We are awaiting the sound. Thank you. Sound is very low, sorry. We're sorry, interpreters cannot hear the gentleman speaking. We're sorry. The only faint sound interpreters have is hailing from the room. We're sorry. Problem persists. Problem persists. Interpreters cannot hear. We're sorry. Interpreters will be able to translate as and when the sound is audible. We are sorry.
Et j'ai pu les amener
And I have brought them to negotiate an agreement that we have negotiated between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. and proceed to the elections 3 hours thereafter. I'm saying this because often mediation is not necessarily strength or might. We need to really know the pros and cons, the weak points and the strong points of the parties. Each use whatever we need to, bring them to accept things that are not going to be prejudicial to them later. This I'm saying because these are things that have occurred again and again in history. My country, Guinea, that was led by Sékou Touré, who was respected because he said in 1958 no to France. The other French-speaking countries have said yes in Africa. When there was a conflict in the neighborhood, he was listened to and heeded. His call was heeded. Back in 1975, the current Burkina Faso and Mali came into conflict. And he was very shocked, seeing, of course, two brotherly, sisterly countries in a conflict this time, and a combination of culture and their personal. So he called on the president of Mali, and they met in Conakry. And as he knows that they also have a good past, and everyone hailing from warriors, they have called, of course, people from Guinea. And during cultural evening, he has given the floor to the singer and lyrics. Traoré, who was very well known, who has talked to each of the heads of state, saying, we would like you to really bring peace between us because we are hailing from excellent reputation and we need, of course, to stop the bloodbath. So get up in order to really honor our forefathers. And immediately they have come and they embraced one another. And this is how we have come over this problem. So mediation is a combination of policy, politics, and supported by someone who has a cultural strength. So there are a lot of conflicts in Africa that can be solved if we use internal resources. The civil war in Liberia that has really ravaged and devastated hundreds of thousands of persons had only been solved by women. And I'm going, of course, to save the best for last. and I will show. Yeah, it has a post. Yes, speak closer to the microphone, please. The president of Liberia and Lansana Conté, the president from Sierra Leone and Guinea. About 5,000 persons who were refugees in the neighbor country. And, of course, and each of them, of course, did not want to stop the fight. After almost 8 years of impossible negotiations by UN-led negotiations, it is the women of the three countries that have created an organization whereby the Union of the Mango River Association. This is something in history. So the group of women, of course, had three categories: very elderly and others and younger, and they have studied the psychological profile of each of the three heads of state and then sent the young girls to, he has been seduced and attracted by the presence of the young girls, and who told him, we have come to you because, of course, we have a compromise. You have to agree with your brethren from Sierra Leone and Liberia. And he told them, if it's yourself and you have the possibility to talk with that, and be with the same around the same table. So, of course, they were a very important part of the negotiation. So a lady diplomat from the group who went to talk to the Sierra Leonean president, telling them, you have served the United Nations. We don't really understand and fathom why you don't expect to negotiate peace. He told them, I'm a diplomat. I ask for that. If we can, of course, try and convince Charles Taylor and Lansana Conté, of course, we'll do that. The most difficult, of course, was the Lansana Conté, the president of Guinea, who is a traditionalist. He did not study a lot, but he really is keen on the respect of religion. They sent him the oldest, the most senior lady. She came to him attacking Lansana Conté. She didn't even tell him, Mr. President, do you think, of course, that he told her, yeah, it's my sister. So in which case you are my son and you're going to heed my call. So Lansana Conté had really put himself in the shoes of her son, and the lady told him, of course, you are the eldest of the three. I do not expect that the three of my children or boys really tear against one another. So I would put you in a room. You're going to come out with a piece of paper and with the conflict solved. So the Morocco has received the three heads of states, and after, of course, at Accra meeting, the women have closed it on the negotiating room with the key, and they came out with the agreement. So this is how the Liberia war has been put an end to. Is that not something beautiful? This boils down to say that in the country there are mechanisms that we have to resort to, and I am convinced that if we revisit our history and tradition, there are some ways and avenues of responding to some avenues. And also, let me talk about ECOWAS and my experience. I am in one of the 4 countries where there were coups and pushes. Yeah, without any secessions. I draw the lesson from the negotiation between the ECOWAS and the different countries, and I have written thereon, and we need to improve the way in which ECOWAS has committed these negotiations/mediation. You cannot impose sanctions on a country and quarantine the head of state and refuse to talk to him and them. You have to start discussion. We cannot say to someone, I put sanction against you and I will send you a mediator and I cannot receive you. If you want to really treat them as pariahs or pacify them, that is not a good thing. Second, you have to send mediators who really are very knowledgeable about the context and understand the dynamics and understand the interest, because each of these conflicts is sometimes behind that there are interests that are invisible to the naked eye. If you highlight them, if you don't commit them, if you don't really introduce them, if you don't really show them interest, you will not be able to come out from it. I think ECOWAS should revisit its protocols so that in the light of these major successes, we can improve and we can capitalize on that, because we are hailing from an area where dynamics are changing. There are more and more young heads of states, and the relations with the former ones and the veterans are not anymore the same. Earlier on, of course, they are not rebels, but they are more strict and in the way of being treated, and the way we've also need to talk to the powers who generally would instill lessons on us. I think that very language, patronizing language, must stop and must change. Thank you. Interpreters are sorry, but we haven't heard almost 70% of the speech. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you doubly, not only for your contribution, but I also thank you for having anticipated on 2 or 3 questions that I will now raise with respect to the mediation, and on which... So we are going to ask the audience to vote on 2 main questions. The first one: is there any African way of mediating? Second question: what is and what should be, in your opinion, the qualities of a good mediator? And the Honorable Prime Minister has raised and zeroed in on 3 questions. The first one: you've talked about the fact that African countries are jealous and rather they prefer to have African solutions for African problems, as the saying goes. The second thing is that you have highlighted the necessity of taking ownership, take up by the society and all of the parties, by the mediation and by the very necessity of having to come out from the conflict. And also, when you've talked about the experience, sketched out the initiatives that you have made and taken to reflect the image and the reputation of a credible and impartial and neutral mediator to discharge their function. The last question, you've talked about a dual mediation of ECOWAS and the African Union, which leads me to this sub-question. Is the multiplication among the UN-based system of mediation of mediators does not sometimes create some competition or somehow neutralization of a mediation by another one? one which is being taken in the African Union and one which is initiated by the regional economic missions. So these are some of the questions that came to my mind in the aftermath of the excellent presentation of Mr. Prime Minister's presentation, former Prime Minister of Guinea, and from one to another Prime Minister, and I now reckon the floor to the former Prime Minister of Burkina Faso. You have, Mr. Prime Minister, the floor. Thank you. Once again, it's an honor and a privilege to be with you, all of you, at the Policy Center for the New South. I think that the very fact of being here together, these are certainly spurges of generosity, and which allows us to really exchange calmly, serenely, and to come out with homogeneous and consensus-based to our problems.
English, and then two will speak in French.
And I will speak in Arabic
and
later on.
No, that's what I say. So I'm going to show solidarity to Ajay, and then to do my intervention in English. The good thing is that I'm coming from Dakar, where I was part of a youth forum in peace and security, youth forum for the Tana Security Forum organized by the Africa Union, the Tana Forum, and then Trust Africa, which is an NGO in Senegal. And they were talking about peace and security, and we're talking about peace and security here. One thing that came to mind in my big brother, Prime Minister Komara, is that we need coordination. And if we do not coordinate, it will be difficult. We cannot have continuous endeavors in peace and security within the continent, and then have at the same time, as the moderator mentioned just now, the United Nations coming with a diversity of views. And then we're not able to merge all this within our culture in Africa, and then see how best we can move forward. So one thing that was coming from this discussion with the youth was that we don't enter the future. It's the same thing that I would say, we don't enter peace and security. We have to create peace and security the same way we have to create the future for the youth. But can we create future for youth if they're not involved? Because what's happening is that elder people create war, we make war, and then younger people will go to fight and die. And then when we talk about peace and security, they're not involved. And yet, they are the majority of the population and the minority of our political ecosystem. So I think this dilemma puts a bit of issue within all what I see in mediation. And also for me, there's no better mediation within our continent in Africa without the involvement of women. Because women are born to be there to mediate among people, among neighbors, among fathers and children. So the same way in peace and security, if we don't involve women and their knowledge and their natural way of accepting, tolerating, being generous, for me it's difficult. When you look at all the mediation endeavors that are going around the world, you hardly see women, and yet we talk about gender balance. We're talking about involvement of women. So women will carry youth with them because they're more inclined to deal with younger people than we are as men. So those are two issues that I wanted to add to what Prime Minister Komara said, and then said as well that there are few issues that I want to raise in the problem that we're facing in Africa with regard to mediation. It's the political and international fragmentation. Issues are different. As I mentioned, the UN will come his way. And then talking about UN, I was just talking to our colleague from the UN, and then I say, and I mean it, choosing a mediator is not about taking somebody who is coming from government and his country doesn't know who and what to do with, and then saying, we'll send you out the peace and security envoy in the east or in the west or in the north. Mediation in peace and security comes with training, a training that will take into account local issues. comme on dit, les facteurs endogènes. The culture. If we don't take this and then get people to be immersed in a region, to understand what are the root causes of the conflict, it will be difficult to mediate. And I want to give an example. I was walking on the streets in Burkina Faso one day, and then I saw a group of children fighting. And then they were fighting, and then one said, no, I'm Mali, you are France. And then the third person said, okay, he gave the name of the mediator who was dealing with the situation. That was beautiful, because it means that to that level, children have integrated the way they perceive conflict, the way they perceive the difficulty that France and Mali are facing, and how somebody can come, a third person can come and try and find a solution. So what I did, I stopped and then say, okay, if you are the mediator, what would you do? He said, but what I'm doing is to first stop them from fighting, and then I listen to them. That's coming from a child. I think that's exactly what we should do. We should be able to listen to each other. We should be able to understand why the problem has started and then to see how we can move forward. And that leads me to my own experience. I was doing mediation, I would say, in the TESPAN Treaty because I was dealing with a sensitive issue between the P5 countries, the nuclear weapon countries. It wasn't easy sometimes to find yourself when the International Data Center gather some information that are suspicious and that you can decide whether they involve one country or another. And obviously it was about Russia often and the United States, because one would come and say, you saw this event, can you tell us what it's all about, whether it has a connotation that is coming from east or this side. And then you are in the middle. But the beauty of the mediation that I could do is because my country has nothing to do with nuclear weapon to start with. And I'm giving this example to say when you are a mediator, you should come clean. Then you can be taken seriously in your discussion and how you mediate. So I've done this and then be advocating for a treaty, the TESPAN Treaty, for many years. I spent 18 and a half years in Vienna for that. And then I was calling to government at a time when the situation was completely, I would say, chaotic. But one of the challenges and the reason why I agreed to join the government was about reconciliation. Reconciliation and about also dealing with my network, the international network that I've had for so many years, how we can gather efforts to deal with the terrorism that is facing the Sahel region. And that was a challenge that we had, and that's why I got involved in this government. But when I was getting involved, I forgot one thing. My late father used to tell me, with politics, you just have to flirt. Don't go to bed with. And I forgot. I went deep into it.
Can we quote you?
You can quote me on that.
All right.
Yeah. I say you can flirt with politics, but you have to be careful. And that's why often when people ask me, you're a political figure, I say, no, I'm a public figure, because the word politics seems a bit difficult. I want to just be flirting and not go further than that. So I'm the last prime minister for a democratic elected government in Burkina Faso. The reason why I'm giving this example is to lead to what Prime Minister Komara said. ECOWAS came to the country right after the coup. And guess what? They claim they've talked to people, but I was sitting home, nobody came and checked what has happened and how we can discuss the situation and how we can move forward. Likewise, people at the time were saying, what is ECOWAS doing here? Because when we had 120 people dying, they didn't come to check or to show compassion. How can they come today and then trying to mediate between those who are, who made the coup, if I can put this way, and the political figures? When you come, you have to be all inclusive. You cannot do mediation if you're not all-inclusive. You cannot do mediation if you choose one part, because you're already showing that you're biased. And that's one of the difficulties that we have. And we don't come as a mediator in a system because we have a friend in the country, because we have a friend in an institution. We come to mediation because we come clean. We want to talk to everyone, whether we like them or we don't like them. And this example is to say that our institutions have not shown consistency, and that's one of the main things in mediation. If you're not consistent, people will never take you seriously. If you don't show consistency, and then today you say X, and tomorrow you say Y, and the next day you go into Z, people will wonder if you're serious about your mediation itself. And now, to finish, is how do we improve our mediation framework within the continent? One would say we need financial resources. It's true. We need financial resources because people have to travel. People have to do this. But I was in another panel in Addis Ababa last year when people say, if your financial resources that you need is about going and asking those that you don't trust, you haven't solved your problem. Because you're creating another problem there. So if we're talking about solution within the continent, we should find resources within the continent so that those who are ready to help us know that we've started somewhere. We cannot wait for the assistance to come before we start our mediation process. And how do we do that? We can do that with our local and cultural framework that exists and that have existed for centuries. Right now in Burkina Faso, when there is an issue, people go to the person who is in Ouagadougou that we call l'Empereur des Mossi, because the Mossi represent over 50% of the population, and then they have a chief. And this tribe was so well organized for centuries. They had their ministers, their reporters, the media, or the person who can talk to this tribe or this other tribe. And this is where people tend to go today. So we have to respect those cultural framework for them to feed our modern system of doing mediation. It's a merge of the two that will help us in the continent and then help us make a difference that we need to prevail peace, so that peace and security can prevail. If we don't do that, I'm not saying we're not importing anything, because we do need assistance. As the moderator and Prime Minister Komara say, we're not closing the door to outsiders to help us, because it's all about sharing experience. It's all about moving together. It's all about finding what's best there that we can bring to party in our play. So if we don't do that, we will not succeed. But we have to take into account civil society, youth, all factors and all layers of our societies so that it's all inclusive. And I'm repeating, inclusive, and we have to be consistent. Mr. Moderator, this is what I wanted to share before we answer the question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for your insights. I think we can identify maybe 2 or 3 elements that you highlighted. The first one is to get women and youth involved in any process. The second one is to go to the root causes and be immersed in the culture, in the African culture, in the local culture. And the last one would be to look for financial resources within the continent or within the local. Well, this last point, I think, raises some questions. If we remind ourselves of the report that has been established by President Kagame, and setting really the ceiling of the contribution of the African countries to 25% only as an ambitious target not even as a minimum, and emphasizing the fact that we will continue to rely 75% on the United States and the European Union and other donors. Is there any possibility, really, given the number of peacekeeping operations that we have, that we can find enough resources within the continent of Africa, especially in the view of the fact that some budgets go beyond 1.2 or 0.3 billion dollars? That's one of the questions. I'm not asking you, Excellency, to address that, but just to keep this in mind before going to our third panelist, Monsieur Jean-Hervé Djesekel. Il est chargé de la...
Who is in charge of the Sahel project management within the International Crisis Group? You have the floor, sir. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would also like to thank the Policy Center for the New South for having invited me to be part of this prestigious event and for also having placed me in this challenging situation of speaking after two excellencies whose insights and intelligence speak for themselves. So I will try to pull a few tricks out of my modest hat as part of the, in my experience as part of the International Crisis Group. And I believe that I will focus on a specific region and try to draw from this particular region a few lessons that might help us to better think about this, the weight of mediation and for the continent. And to do so, we must first conduct a diagnosis of the Central Sahel region, which is faced with the jihadist insurrections. I mean, it will be a very simple summary. And actually, for the past 10 years, the situation has been gotten from bad to worse. We are there is an extension of the violent zones, but there's also an aggravation of violence against civilians. And today we are in the Sahelian region, which is one of the worst crises that the continent has been exposed to, not the only one, but one of the worst crises. However, we cannot say that this region was neglected. I mean, for the past 10 years, there have been a wide array of interventions and stabilization attempts. And so this which has unfortunately failed to contain the extension of the violence and the threats. If it's failed, it's due to multiple reasons. But one of the main reasons is that it has much too exclusively relied on military solutions and security solutions, and having also sent to the back burner without eliminating them as much the mediation approaches or political dialogue. So it is true that there have been some attempts at dialogue, and for instance, the Algiers process, but these initiatives that were instrumental to the Sahelian region suffered from a series of limitations. I'd like to mention three that might help us push forward. The first is that we've had solutions that were substantially imposed by foreign countries. And so these outsiders, these external countries that impose the terms and conditions of the Algiers Agreement to the local actors, be it from the state side or the non-state actors that were part of the insurrection forces. And so the second limitation, as I mentioned earlier, is that the military objectives disrupted the dialogue-related objectives. And in a nutshell, an agreement had to be signed to better set apart on the military playing field the good players and the bad players. And the third factor, I believe that we have for much too long considered in the Sahelian region, I believe it is all, this concerns a majority of political players. Well, it was considered that political dialogue was mere rhetoric, and so it was simply to either celebrate one's victory or state a defeat, and nothing in between. And so the Algiers Agreement and others as well illustrate in the Sahelian region the weak little room that was left to political mediation and the very weak political dialogue, and which was reflected in the way that the region seems to be going deeper and deeper in violence and insurrection. And I was thinking about our group, where in the Central Sahelian region in particular, there's a real capacity for dialogue, mediation among states and the societies themselves. I believe, actually, this is one of the strengths of these states and these societies. When the crisis began a decade ago, people started to rush into trying to conduct a diagnosis, and so the gaps of the states, that there was no army, there was no security, their assets weren't, or their strengths weren't featured or studied. And one of the strengths of these states is their impressive capacity for mediation and their impressive capacity for internal political dialogue. In Mali, it's often said that we're never two phone calls away from Kourouba. That is where the presidency is. And so any village is no further than 2 phone calls away from the president's cabinet. And I think that very few countries can claim to have these close ties and such tangible ties between a leader and his or her constituents. And so it is true that these ties have been weakened by a decade-long conflict, but these ties still do exist, and these ties should be strengthened. This also goes by way of non-traditional channels. It is not necessarily the elected officials that make that connection. They do so, but it's not only them. For instance, there are the non-traditional authorities, for instance, the groups and women's groups. For instance, there are the youth associations, tribes, religious organizations that can all play this mediator role. There's a great potential here that was much too long undertapped by internationals, but also by the current regimes, because it's been quite a few years now that this international framework has been dismantled, and we end up with these regimes that are led by the military, but we still tend to emphasize these military solutions and that have yet to prove their efficiency. So to conclude, I would like to suggest 3 actionable measures, and that's our signature within our organization, ICGs, to put forth solutions. And so in the Sahel, there is a multidimensional crisis and a dimensional crisis, and which requires multidimensional solutions. So far, they relied on 3 main pillars. If you read all of these strategies, and there's a plethora of those, these rely on 3 main pillars, which are security, governance, and development. However, to date, we have not thought about how we could create a synergy between all of these 3 pillars. And so, in fact, it is the security pillar, and more specifically, the military pillar, that took precedence over the others. And in the Sahel region, it is high time to reverse the trend. It is important to develop these multidimensional strategies, for sure, but I believe that the political pillar, or the main tool, which is dialogue, should be dominant, and so the development of security pillars should support this dialogue and not the other way around. The second point, I believe that today there's an advocacy that needs to be conducted with the current Sahelian authorities to reinstate a dialogue. Even if there have been quite a few limitations in the recent years, but the regimes that have established themselves that were dominated by military figures tend to focus on quasi-exclusive solutions. And today, it is high time to try to engage in a dialogue with them, to suggest to them to support these Sahelian forces and tell them that they have other assets, that they boast other assets. And so in the Sahelian government's toolbox, there are other tools that they have hidden in their toolbox rather than force and military force. And so this is a dialogue that needs to be led in the different states. But in the region, the West African region, and ECOWAS in particular, there is definitely room for improvement to strengthen these ties. For those of you that monitor the situation in the region, so the creation of a Sahel alliance would be great, but unfortunately it led to a fragmentation between this organization and ECOWAS. And here again, there's an urgent need for dialogue and mediation to glue the pieces back together and relaunch an institution integration, without which there would be no solution in the region. I just arrived from Senegal, and so where I've been based for the past 10 years, and this is where the good news is for the region, is the arrival today of a third possibility in the region, and this younger powers, but that reached the higher levels of government through democracy, and this bears great hope, not only for the region but also for the whole Sahel. Mr. Jean-Hervé Zegel, thank you very much for your great contribution, and thank you for having enriched the final report of this conference with the 3 recommendations that you've graced us with when concluding your remarks. I hope that the rest of the panelists will follow your example. It is true that in the different processes that have been led, even if we don't specifically emphasize on security, at the end of the day, all resources and all attention is channeled towards security issues, because we always feel that without security, well, nothing else can be done, and that with security, that security is the cornerstone for the rest. There was a declaration adopted by the African Union in Tangier recently, which in fact emphasized the security and development nexus. And so this is something that's been discussed for quite some time in the UN and elsewhere, but so far we have not yet been able to draw some tangible conclusions to gear these actions. The ECOWAS at the time was the role model in terms of dynamics, momentum, conflict management, mediation. But unfortunately, over the past couple of years, and given some positions made, and there seems to be a confusion made in the way that the objectivity and neutrality has been challenged, which in a way did hamper this effectiveness of ECOWAS. And we all hope that ECOWAS can replay the role for which it was actually established, because its success is also hinged upon the success of other economic, regional economic communities. You also emphasize the arrival of a new generation of political leaders, and you've referenced Senegal. I'd also like to add another point of optimism, and maybe this also this feat by Mauritania and Senegal, which I'm sure will have a positive domino effect on the public policies of these countries and the integration among both of these countries. And I might add, even beyond this idea of integration, there's an intensification of relations, which can be a precious plus, with regard to this royal initiative towards the Sahelian countries, to involve them in an economic, geostrategic project of having Africa opening up to the Atlantic and reaching out to these countries in order for them to tap into and leverage the existing infrastructure and hopefully be able to export these ideas to the Atlantic. And so this is a project that is particularly dear to our hearts in Morocco, but this definitely has not only is echoed not only in the region, but further down south in Africa. Our last speaker is Mr. Ajay Sethi, who is a member of a body that we unfortunately continue to appoint or designate as a unit, which does not bear witness to a body which plays a very important role in preventive diplomacy and mediation. You have the floor, sir.
As usual, the UN has been called in the end, and it's very difficult to look wise after 3 wise co-panelists and in front of equally wise audience. But I will give it a shot and try to make sure that I don't repeat many of the wise things which have already been mentioned, and I'll be short. So, I mean, I am a serving UN staff member, and I am coming from New York, but never in New York, always been traveling to different hotspots, and I always thank people who give me opportunity to wear a tie and a coat. Otherwise, I am generally in a bush, either talking to conflict parties or, but I'm more comfortable there. This is very intimidating. Thank you so much. The Policy Center for New South for inviting. In terms of, I'll straight go into some of the issues, and these are my comments and my views and not the organization views. So there's a total disclaimer there, because I am the only one amongst you who can get into a trouble.
Duly noted.
Yeah, so in terms of the institutional and political challenges which you were speaking about, I think let me focus quickly on 4 major points on the institutional challenges which we have. And we are focused on the African continent. And we also have to remember, which I think all of you and us are proud of, is that Africa is the only continent in the world whose regional organizations and 80% of the sub-regional organizations have a formal mandate to mediate. It is not so anywhere in the world. You look at any regional organization, we have major challenges today in Myanmar, in ASEAN, who picks up and who calls the names and shames, and so it is a very complicated affair. So I think that's a good start to have. But then the biggest institutional challenge comes into play here is, how do you bridge the gap between the mandate and delivery? And a wishful thinking in between, that you want to do a lot, but then what are the tools and platforms available to you, forums available to you to deploy and employ? I'll just use the mic, or maybe mic is better now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So the thing is that how do you bridge this gap? So capacity is a major issue, and I remember in 2005-4 onwards, so I was a senior advisor on ceasefires to the African Union mediation in Darfur in Abuja when we were talking. And since then, a lot of distance has been covered, and a lot of water has flown down many rivers in the continent. So there is a tremendous progress, but I would say there are still major potential for that to happen. But then the question comes is, whose capacity are we talking about? Is the mediation going to be centralized in the hands of few who rest in the regional organization, or are we going to expand this capacity building and empowerment to the regional levels, to national levels, local levels? And what does even a local national mean in a context? It's not a monolithic continent, culturally speaking, religiously speaking. It is not a monolithic continent we are talking about. So for each country, the religious context, the rural context, the urban context, everything changes with every 50 or 80 miles in this continent. Therefore, we have to be careful not to be generic enough to say, okay, local mediation is very good and we need to empower them. Local mediators also have a political nuance. Mm-hmm. So we have to be following the principle of due diligence and do no harm, rather than creating another dimension in a conflict by empowering some people who claim to be the local mediators. Then, of course, the institutions, who are the clients who want to receive the capacity, and we have to ensure, as the people who give capacity, not to corrupt them through foreign juntas and tours. So what happens is that the demand is supply situation. Sometimes this capacity building is driven by the supply quotient and not by the demand quotient. And one of the major factors I would try to give an recommendation here is that I am a coordinator of a ceasefire mediation course in Oslo, which we do once in a year. And we make sure that we invite people from the continent every year. 2 to 3 seats are there, IGAD, ECOSAC, and we have the African Union. The chief of mediation, Ekol, was here with me in Oslo this year. But the problem is, when I reach out to the regional and sub-regional organizations, can you suggest to me a local mediator who needs to be brought, especially women, who need to be brought to Oslo for training? We do not get the names. So there is a mapping, serious mapping required of who these mediators are. And this mapping, I am not anybody to judge anyone. People are doing great jobs, but we can still do quite a lot better. We do not want to bring people so that their curriculum vitae and bios are embellished by a visit to Oslo. We want to bring real people who are to be attired with the knowledge and capacities in the real sense, who will go on the ground and deliver. And then the financial support, institutionally speaking, all the eminent, my co-panelists have spoken about it, but I just want to add one nuance there. Financial efforts are required, but more than that, the sustainability is important. If you can finance a part of a process and you are not ready to have the capacity, financial support to walk the talk, then only talks will happen and nobody shall be there to walk the talk. And I am very careful, as I told you, I'm a serving member. I do not want to name a specific member state or a context, but I am seeing it with a broken heart, because a ceasefire has been achieved, things are moving, and suddenly no funds, no money. So if financial efforts are being looked at with diligence, I think the most important thing is sustainability. You should be able to sustain the process and not finance only a segment of it. Political challenges, I think a lot has already been mentioned by my co-panelists. So I would only try to bring one more. I'm a practitioner, so mine is a practitioner's perspective. So these days are impossible days in Security Council. It's a very complicated, geopolitical context in which we are going through. And I was talking to a very senior, I won't say the rank or the country, but Prime Minister equivalent level, and I was joking with him that, why don't you look back, you are almost my age, you look back your class notebooks from 1984 to 1992, specifically that period. That's the time we are going to live through in the next about a decade or so. And the African continent is not spared from that, and the geopolitics is there, which is a major issue. Then the issue is about multipolarity. Multipolarity leads to multiple forums of mediation. So in many contexts, African Union has the lead. In many contexts, IGAD has a lead, or different. I'm just giving you an example. And in many cases, the UN has the lead. This comparative advantage of each actor has to be understood. The African leadership, and especially the regional organization, we have to all understand, sit down and take a step back and realize that what are our comparative advantages. So rather than being competitive, I think it's very important to be complementary. And this competitiveness is already costing almost about 1,200 lives on a weekly basis in Sudan. And I'm openly telling you, this is the most forgotten conflict geopolitically, and a lot of people are dying there, and your heart bleeds. And now you talk about the local efforts and local mediation. So we were trying to achieve a local ceasefire in a specific place, I won't name that, and the local mediators 24/7 talking to, what can people like me, teach them? They are the gurus, they teach us. We don't tell them anything. We just try to add a comma or some. When they the mic, I hope is okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
Mike.
Yeah. Yeah, I think. Okay. So the thing is, even small support, the local mediators have tremendous knowledge to convene, listen to parties. They have all the possible attributes. A simple thing like Hadratuk, do not draft a ceasefire agreement with more than 4 provisions. Do not add the following provisions in the agreement. That's more than enough. They do not need a classroom. They do not need a capacity building session or 3 days of workshop. A few things, a few red flags for them, and that's done. And that has sometimes done. So we have to be adaptive in our ways in which we support local mediation efforts. The multiplicity of forums is the biggest challenge, politically speaking, and that's what I was referring to, and this has to go. Now, African continent has multiple contexts in which uniformity of approaches is a big challenge today. Can we be uniform and coherent in all our approaches? Can we say that a president who's been president for 37 years, there's a democracy, and then I'm just using the critique of the local newspapers, or there is a new revolution or a military coup that has happened is bad or good? So what is good, what is bad, what is our approaches? And as Prime Minister was saying, consistency. Consistency is a big challenge, an attribute, challenge, and also an opportunity. So how prescriptive can African Union or regional organization be in their approaches to mediation is a question mark to myself, and I don't have an answer for this. Then the hybrid approaches. The political challenges, hybrid approaches is another recommendation that the regional organizations and the member states who mediate conflicts in Africa have to be really adaptive to the new reality of hybrid approaches, wherein you have multiplicity of a forum and special envoys in one country. And how do you deal with that? And then when it comes to the contexts themselves, we have to understand that we try to focus only on the mediation from a diagnostic perspective. But how many times have we in the continent appointed envoys who are there to prevent conflicts from happening? So prognostic methodology and prevention is one aspect. And I am telling you from a very, very practitioner's perspective. I am not an academic person. I am a plumber and a carpenter. People call me for resolving problems. But sometimes when you do that, you see the underbelly and the uglier part of the processes. So could this be done if we had appointed a special envoy 3 months in advance or not? Yes, we could have. And sometimes this traction and momentum is lost because we are not prompt. Therefore, our diagnostic has to turn into prognostic approaches. And therefore, another aspect of the mediation is that mediation happens every time. It's not that only the peace agreements will need mediation. So when the prevention has happened or not happened, then there is sometimes a big gap when you are informally trying to interact and engage the parties. And that's the zone of conflict management. And conflict management requires much stronger mediatory efforts, whether they are informal, formal, known, not known, or they are open and closed, secret or not. but the conflict management has to be brought into the domain of our thinking and our strategies in the continent. And lastly, I would say, what are the new approaches? And without being repetitive, one thing is important. There are two aspects to it. How do the institutions like AU, IGAD, and so many other sub-regional organizations, all of them with due regards, how do they deploy and employ mediation? And the second aspect of this question is, how do these mediators or facilitators approach mediation in their own respective contexts? So one is anchored in capacity and the other one is anchored in the political context which we are talking about. Use of technology. I mean, inclusive approaches we have understood already, and Prime Minister was very candid, and I'm really grateful for that point. Without women, there is absolutely no way forward. And this is not a cliché point which somebody gave to me in New York, that please mention that women should be part of it. I have seen with my own personal experience, women giving you that last key to open the lock sometimes. Different perspectives are very important. And we cannot neglect 50% of the global humanity in a context without even including them or talking to them. Inclusion could mean anything in a religious context or a cultural context, but what is suffice to say that their voices have to be heard and factored into any deal making which is happening in mediation processes. And my last point is the use of technology. The technology has really given us so much today that while sitting in the room, you can reach out to many. We have done some of the mediation dialogues. Again, I wouldn't like to name the context for the respect of that member state. We have done mediation dialogues through WhatsApp messages and through analog messages, just sitting in one room. And that was very much liked by people. We had ensured inclusion of voices, opinions, by just sitting in one place. So the use of technology has to be, be used as a force multiplier. And that's why this is an important point to consider. I think shortage of time. And thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Adjai. You raised, I think, 2 or 3 issues on which I would like to make just a very brief comment. One is how to bridge the gap between the mandate and delivery. I think one of the answers would be to really work on the proper mandate in the beginning of the peace operation. It's extremely fundamental because there is always this tendency of copy and paste, taken from different conflict situations, and try maybe just to adjust few elements and put it in a draft resolution in Security Council that we adopted in a few minutes, and that's it. Because everybody is in a hurry to send the peace operation. Sending a peace operation become an end in itself, just to deal with the situation as quickly as possible because the public opinion is aware of the situation. The second one is about sustainability of financial means. If I go to a donor country and ask him for financing 6 or 7 years because I want to ensure the sustainability, he will say, well, why not just begin by 1 year plan, and then we will see how the dynamic will work. So most of the times, you have first to put one foot, and then let the dynamic do the work. How to build the expertise is something that is important in mediation, because it's not only important to appoint a mediator. Well, the team that is behind that could provide the expertise initiatives, and is very important. And finally, we all know that there is a new agenda for peace that is negotiated in New York. I hope that the outcome of this session and other sessions from different parts of Africa will feed into the documentation that will serve to adopt a new agenda for peace. With all this, I would like you to give hand to our four panelists, because they really deserve it. And now, in the light of this very rich and insightful discussion, we are going, I think, to post two basic questions. One is about, your preference will go to an African mediator or non-African mediator? The second one, what would we require? I don't remember exactly the labeling of my two questions, but the second question is about the best profile of a good mediator, as I said, in the light of what has been said by the distinguished four panelists. Only one question. So, well, they decided to limit to one question. So let's go for one question. Do you prefer to see an African or non-African mediator in African conflicts? African is 90%, non-African is 11%. Still going. I think there is a decent balance that is growing in favor of. If I am in favor of an African mediator, I have to stop the exercise right now. I will be biased, but 73%, I think. 72%. So let's maybe just. Oh, no, I don't think so. We will not go 50-50. For obvious reason, I think the panelists will abstain from voting, of course. Okay, I think we will most probably have 70-30. Can you tell me when it's done? I think we have a clear idea about the preference of the audience. Given the increasing number of votes in favor of a non-African, maybe which is documented by some cases in which, in conflict situations, we had the appointment of African envoys or African mediators, and after that, they switched to European or American, etc., etc. I think this maybe calls for some kind of comments. Why do we prefer? Is it a seek of objectivity? Is it a seek of a mediator that can have an influence on one or the other party? Is it because of the financial support that is behind one given personal envoy? What are your views, Mr. Prime Minister?
I think no, it's okay. We had this discussion over coffee just now. We're talking about an example in Southeast Asia, where it took a longer period of time to find a mediator. I think we're talking about, and it was a matter of whether we bring an external person or an internal person. I think for me, The key issue is the credibility of the mediator. That's what is key, the credibility of the mediator. Somebody who shows patte blanche, who is not subject to the influence to external influence or internal influence. Because even if you have an African mediator and somebody who has been involved in issue relating to one country or another, or even an internal issue, whether it's from Africa or not, he cannot be a good mediator because he will be seen as somebody who is impartial, or if not even if impartial is too strong, somebody who has difficulty of showing consistency because he's been involved in other issues. I wanted to touch one other problem about the finance. You said the question, is it financial or not? And sustainability of the financing. You mentioned President Kagame. When he came with the idea of financing the Africa Union by African, for sustainability, we can decide to say we're taking 1% or 2% of a budget of each country to be dedicated to youth or to peace and security. That could be a decision that the continent makes. The same way we have airport taxes, or we have taxes on air ticket, flight ticket, and so forth. This is something that can be done to keep the sustainability of the funding or the financing. And the reason why I've mentioned this is, if you want help from outside, you have to show already that you're doing something for yourself.
Right.
Then people are tempted to come and help you.
Yeah.
You cannot sit and say, I can't do anything because I don't have finance, and then I need finance from outside. And this is what I was trying to talk about, having a financial framework ourselves that will attract finance from others if they're willing to be part of what we put as our main priority.
Well, if I remember, I think that in his report, Paul Kagame suggested 2% to be paid by African countries on their export to non-African countries. But it was not, unfortunately, adopted by the majority it required, so that it could. And I mean, one cannot but agree with Your Excellency that if you want people to help you, you have to help yourself first. You have to show that you are responsible, that you are devoted, that you are dedicated to the objective. And I think that's the support. People will not hesitate to support you if you make a genuine effort.
If you allow me just 1 second, something came to my mind is about the different peace and security platforms. You know, I'm thinking of the Munich Security Conference. If you take 15 years ago, the Munich Security Conference was about Euro-Atlantic.
Right.
And I think they've realized, and then rightly so, and then they should be thanked for that, is that you cannot talk about Euro-Atlantic security if you don't add African security. How you move from military security to human security, how those two can dovetail. And I think when we mention coordination, there is a need to have all the mediators or mediation institutions around the globe to connect and then coordinate their effort and understand what are their issues so that we can find the best solution forward and assist the United Nations that is in great need, especially in this current geopolitical context.
Thank you. Ajay, please, as briefly as we can. I think even if my colleague did not blame me for extending the session, I feel that there is some dissuasive actions coming, so I try to prevent that.
And we support you, so I'll be very short.
Thank you.
There are two things here. Your question, whether an African or a non-African mediator. So there is already an assumption that the conflict, this decision is being made outside the African continent. If the decision was within the African continent, of course there will be an African envoy. When it comes to the Security Council, the geopolitics has assured that selection itself is so instrumentalized by the platform it's a nightmare if one special envoy resigns and goes home. I think that is the most terrible night for that mission, and because it is going to take forever now to. I think, to the best of my memory, Colombia mission and Colombia case is one case which is people are okay. You know, no geopolitics is there, and there's not much. But then practically every other conflict becomes mired in the. And to be fair, to be fair to everyone, they all have their interests in mind, global security in mind from their own perspective. But it's a challenging process. And in the end, I think, and I'll be like a true UN person, I don't think it's about the continents, it's about the basic ingredients of what makes a great mediator.
Yes.
And you have a context, and I, again, have no qualms in mentioning Sudan, whereas the main parties to conflict in Sudan have rejected the mediation efforts of IGAD, and they have opinions on AU. So this multiplicity of forums and the forum shopping by the parties to conflict. This is the forum shopping happening based on somebody else's convenience. So we have to keep all this in mind. But of course, the cultural naivety of any envoy is never helpful. So one has to be really culturally alive, sensitive to the context, and also able. So there is a multiple, the tick marks which have to be enjoyed. But in terms of money, I'm just coming quickly on the money part. The sustainability is a question, definitely. And I understand that the member states who are traditional funders and donors, and I can assure you that sources are also drying up. You will see it in next 3 to 4 years. I am not a soothsayer or a crystal ball gazer, but the whole funding scenario is becoming gloomy because of certain other reasons. Now there are non-traditional funders coming up. Now money is not money. The flus, as they say, is political, siyasi. Not flus is not about just a paper note. Who gives it, to whom it is given, how it is given, for what purpose is all political. So therefore, I think what African continent and the people can do is look at multiple sources, multiplicity of sources, enhance your sources, and then have a better way of putting up that paper on the table is required for what? There is an itemized billing requirement today that, okay, every process will require so much money, and then you calculate and then have a sustainability agreement with them. But yes.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes, there is no time for. I'm not going to be popular with the audience because I'm told that time is up and there is no time for questions and answer sessions, and I think I'm the one to be blamed for that because I did not master the timing of this session. I would like to maybe one word for for Your Excellency and for Jean Hervé.
Okay. Merci beaucoup. Moi, je voudrais juste dire.
Thank you very much. I would just like to say that it's extremely difficult to choose a special envoy or any objective mediator. Because already when you are to prepare the terms of references of your special envoy, there are lots of things that are being instrumentalized in this selection. So many things that are being instrumentalized. They're putting him literally a ring on the finger. So you have to bear that in mind. So there are lots of suspicions around this person, in the person of the mediator, and we need to understand the kinds of dynamics that are operating, downstairs. So things are not neutral in the choices of mediators. And when you come at the end of a period that goes towards elections time, this envoy works with a person of CDAO, of ECOWAS, and he doesn't know how the heads of states are going to read the suggestions. If the commissioner to political affairs goes against the interest of one of the heads of states, there's going to be an issue. So they have to seize upon the pressure made by one or two of the heads of states, and these are parts of the mandates that they have. It's extremely difficult, and we have to be very wary and be extremely understanding. And I'd like to give you another example, something coming out of the continent.
Within the framework of a training for 40 heads of states, former heads of state and head of government. Yeah, and we had to act. So, of course, there were Obasanjo and myself, and the others were former heads of states of Colombia who were in favor of the opponent. So they proposed that we talk through video conferencing so that we can be sensitive to his case to support them vis-a-vis the international community. You see, so those who were hosting us were already the ones who were financing and bankrolling, who wanted us to go to that end. Obasanjo and myself, of course, we said, well, if you've brought us here to talk about a situation which is an objective, of course, we'd just leave the room here and now. But what we were saying at the path that you would follow, of course, so we said, of course, this gentleman could not, of course, go and from Venezuela. This means that he's manipulated by the U.S. and the elections will take place in such a way as not to occur the way they wanted it to occur. Thank you, Mr. Former Prime Minister Jean Hervé. You have the last word now. 2 points, if I may. The first on the question, us researchers would like, of course, to put into question the question. And the question is interesting, of course, but it would deserve to be asked otherwise. Africans, non-African, this is an important element or component. This is one of the components of the choice being made. And today, if we, sorry to take, of course, the region of the Raja Sahel region, which I know the least well, of course, we need a major African mediator for Africa. Now, but of course, some nationalities would be ex officio excluded from the sub-region, and also they would not be adequate or sufficient to talk to militaries. Today, you need to have someone who knows how to speak to military, so there's a whole slew of parameters to be taken into account. The second point on the question of financing, of course, this very question of financing is important indeed. Who possesses the key to the money also owns the key to the answer. But the effort here, or the advantage of the floor, is that it is not as costly or hefty as other tools. And when you use a mission or take a mission just like MINUSMA, which cost more than 1 billion per annum, a very small fraction of this mission, which was quite hefty, was dedicated to the good offices of the mission, which, albeit, has been one of the best things that has ever operated these past years in a MINUSMA. I would finish with that. I think it has been shown, demonstrated, that the cost between an operation which is organized, led by the international organization, and the cost by the member states go from 1 to 7-fold, 8-fold the cost. Hence, when we commit collectively, we save quite a lot of money and finance of the country and the population. Thank you very much. Thank you. We're grateful also to the audience. And once again, sorry to have not or have deprived you of the right to which you are entitled to ask questions. So I will be taking any criticisms.
For a panel photo. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now take a 20-minute coffee break in the dining hall across from this auditorium. We will reconvene at 5:10 p.m. sharp.